Good evening, and welcome back to SL Tonight. I'm Felix Lubezki, and tonight we're diving into a delightful little piece of 1920s humor called Mr. Binger Buys a Bed by Bertram Lebhar. It's a story of one ordinary man who makes a perfectly simple decision that quickly turns into a hilarious chain of domestic chaos. No monsters, no epic quests, just good old-fashioned everyday comedy that still lands perfectly today. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this charming classic short story. Chapter 1. Fit for a King. If you like peanuts, the chances are at least 50 to 1 that no matter in what part of the United States you may live, you have done your share towards paying for the palatial white stone residence of Mr. Horatio Binger, which is one of the show places of Riverside Drive. It is likely, too, that Mrs. Horatio Binger is partially beholden to you for the gorgeous strings of perfectly matched pearls which not infrequently encircle her short, rotund throat, and costly furs which swathe her portly form, and the luxurious upholstered limousine which is often to be seen standing in front of the exclusive Fifth Avenue stores in which she likes to do her shopping. Even if you're not a consumer of salted peanuts, you have no doubt heard of Binger, the Peanut King. The $1 million he spends each year on advertising has, of course, made you familiar with those which are with famous little pink wax paper packages, which are identified with his name. And perhaps you have read about him in the news columns or the Sunday supplement of your favorite newspaper. For every once in a while, when the editors find themselves short of human interest stuff, they seize upon some excuse for retelling the story of the man who began his commercial career by vending roasted peanuts from a pushcart outside of one of the entrances to Central Park, and 15 years later was the head of a business which occupied a whole floor in the loftiest office building on Lower Broadway. Mr. Binger, however, is not the hero of the story. He figures here merely as the employer of a young man named Ralph Henry Parker, an obscure young man, of whom the odds are more than 1,000 to 1 you've never heard. Parker held the position of an assistant bookkeeper in the general offices of Horatio Binger & Co., Inc. His salary was $22 per week. He lived in a shabby, genteel boarding house on a shabby, genteel street on the Upper West Side of Manhattan Island. But there was nothing shabby about Ralph Henry himself. On the contrary, it was a source of some wonder to his fellow clerks how he managed to put up such a good front on such a scanty pay. For there was no denying that he was easily the best-dressed, most dapper member of the office force. It was rumored that he was the offspring of a wealthy family, that he had had independent income, and that the contents of his weekly pay envelope were merely chicken feed to him. Like most rumors, however, this was very far from the truth. Both for his wearing apparel and his sustenance, he was entirely dependent on the wages he drew from the business of the Peanut King, and his father was a poor but honest blacksmith in a New England town. He had a cousin, though, in New York, who was in the tailoring business, and who let him have his clothes at cost price. That was one of the reasons why Ralph Henry was able to make such a good appearance on such a limited income. But the main reason was that he stinted himself in every other way so as to be able to spend most of his salary on fine raiment. Before he started out from the parental blacksmith shop to seek his fortune, young Parker had read that in New York clothes went a long way towards making the man, in spite of the copybook bromide to the contrary. And believing what he read and being eager to succeed, he had vowed that he would always be well dressed even if he had to get along on 2 meals a day in order to manage. You see, it was not vanity with him, it was ambition. Up to the time of a certain auction sale, however, it did not look as though Ralph Henry's formula for success was going to work out very well. He had been laboring at the assistant bookkeeper's desk in the Eastern Sales Department of the Salted Peanuts concern for over 2 years, and he was no farther than he was when he started. His office associates had nicknamed him Beau Brummel, and several of the young women stenographers regarded him with obvious favor, but those things altogether, gratifying in their way, did not get him anywhere when it came to advancement. Mr. Rooney, the head of his department, did not appear to be greatly impressed by his dapper appearance, so far as giving him a chance to climb the ladder was concerned. And as for president and majority stockholder of Horatio Binger & Co., Inc., That great man hardly seemed to be aware of his existence. Perhaps Mr. Binger, as he passed daily through the big general office, with its threescore employees on his way to or from his private sanctum, had noticed the good-looking, well-groomed young man who sat at a desk in a corner of the vast room, but if so, his observation had been casual, and almost subconscious. To him, Ralph Henry was nothing more than a humble cog in a human machine which helped promote the sales of the pink tissue paper package, much too unimportant a person to command individual attention. But on the morning of the day on which the personal effects of Miss Janet Willoughby Mooresman, widow of John K. Mooresman, the late copper magnate, were disposed of at a public auction, Mr. Binger came down to business with an expression of excitement on his full moon countenance. As he entered the outer office, his keen, gimlet eyes swept the occupants of the room and finally rested on young Parker, whom he now regarded with particular interest. Then he walked over to the latter's desk. "Young man," he said, "I need someone to go uptown for me on some personal business, and I think you'll do it. Come into my office." Ralph Henry arose with alacrity and followed his chief into the adjoining room. Perhaps it had come at last, the opportunity he had long been eagerly awaiting. Mr. Binger seated himself at his massive mahogany desk, and again made a searching survey of his employee, scrutinizing him closely from head to foot. Evidently, the second inspection was as satisfactory as the first, for a slight confirmatory nod, the older man invited Parker to be seated. "You look like a reliable, discreet young fellow. I guess you'll do. This errand that I'm going to send you on is one that requires considerable discretion." "Yes, sir," exclaimed Ralph Henry eagerly. He was quite sure now that his big chance had arrived. He was in direct personal contact at last with the man who held his future in the palm of his hand. If he made good on this mission, whatever its nature, there was no telling what might come of it. From his humble $22 a week job as assistant bookkeeper, he might jump almost immediately to a big executive position. Meteoric rises, he was aware, were the rule rather than the exception in the New York business world. Once one had succeeded in attracting the attention of the boss, the rest was comparatively easy. And Binger had picked him out for this confidential business matter from all the 60 employees in the outer office. His pulses quickened at that reflection. If he failed to make the most of this golden opportunity, he told himself, he'd be undeserving of another smile from fortune. "I want you to go uptown for me and buy a bed," the employer went on. "A bed?" Parker echoed, unable to conceal his disappointment. "Is that all, sir?" "It's not an ordinary bed," Binger explained, frowning at the interruption. "The piece of furniture I have in mind is... Well, read this before we go any further and you'll understand." He picked up a newspaper from his desk and handed it to Ralph Henry, pointing with a pudgy forefinger to a news item marked with blue pencil. $50,000 bed to be sold at auction. Magnificent piece of furniture that a Bavarian king once slept on, among famous Mooresman collection to go underhand of today. All the personal effects of Miss John K. Mooresman, who, since the death of her husband, the millionaire copperman, has met with financial reverses, are to be sold under the auctioneer's hammer at the Marlborough Gallery. The sale, which will begin this morning, is to include the entire famous Mooresman collection of art and antiques which cost the late copper mine owner several $1 million. One of the most notable articles on the catalog is a historical massive bed which once belonged to the Mad King Godfrey of Bavaria. Mr. Mooresman brought it in Europe 5 years ago at the time of his death as the royal owner and prized it above all other treasures of his superb collection. Aside from historic associations, the bed is a magnificent piece of furniture, truly fit for a king. It has a high headboard of a rare polished wood and supports a canopy of heavy drapery. The footboard is heavy overlaid with bronze carvings and its trimming of bronze run around the sides and up the corners. Mr. Mooresman is said to have paid $50,000 for it and to have considered that he was getting a rare bargain. The well-known feud between Mooresman and Horatio Binger, the Peanut King, is said to have originated over this bed. At the time it was in the market, Binger wished to buy it for his wife, who was ambitious to sleep in a bed on which a royal head had once reposed. The Copper Man got there first, however, and a bitter quarrel resulted between the families of the two millionaires. Whether the Peanut King still wants the bed and will be bitter at the sale is not known. There is no doubt, however, that there are several millionaires in New York who would like to acquire this remarkable piece of furniture, and the bidding of it is expected to be brisk. You see, said Mr. Binger as his employee finished reading, the job I'm giving you, young man, is one that is going to require a lot of tact and horse sense. I want to buy that bed as a wedding anniversary present for my wife. I want it to be a surprise. That's one reason why I cannot attend the auction sale myself. Newspaper reporters would be sure to recognize me and would publish my name as the purchaser, which would spoil the whole idea. Besides, if they knew that I was after it, those auction fellows would be likely to run up the price. I understand that sort of thing is done even at the most reliable auctioneer. So I want you to go up there and bid for the bed as though you were buying it for yourself. Not under any circumstances, you understand, are you to let it be known that you're acting as my agent or connected with me in any way. You look like a gentleman, so you ought to be able to buy it, all right. That's why I've selected you for the errand. I understand, Mr. Binger, said Ralph Henry eagerly. You can depend on me, sir, not to give the secret away. He paused. How high do you wish me to bid in case there should be keen competition? Go the limit, his employer responded, his eyes glinting. I want that bed, even if it costs me $1 million. I can't think of anything in the world that would please Miss Binger more than to receive that bit of furniture on the morning of our wedding anniversary. You'll have to look out to those reporter fellows, though, he added. They're a sharp lot, and when the bed's knocked down to you, they'll probably buzz around like a flock of bumblebees, trying to find out who you are and what you're going to do with it. They may even go to the trouble of shadowing you to try to get a line on you, so you'll have to be mighty careful. I'll manage the newspapermen all right, Parker declared confidently. But after I've got the bed, what am I to do with it? Where shall I tell them to deliver it? Tell them to hold it until it is sent for. I can attend to that myself later. I suppose I'll have to pay a deposit for it. It's usual, I believe, at auction sales, particularly where the customer isn't known. Mr. Binger reached for his checkbook. I beg your pardon, Parker put in. The check would hardly do, at least not your own check. Your signature would give the secret away. That's right, King assented, regarding Ralph Henry approvingly. I see you got a head on you, young fellow. As you say, a check wouldn't do. You'll have to take some cash with it. He produced a bulging wallet, then, with a shrewd glance at his employee, changed his mind and replaced the wallet in his pocket. The chap looked honest, but after all, one could never tell. He unbuttoned his waistcoat and from the lined pocket drew a single banknote of saffron hue, which he had placed there separately for safekeeping. Its denomination was $1,000. If this young man should happen to yield to temptation, he would have a harder task trying to dispose of a single $1,000 bill than of the same amount in smaller currency. Moreover, Mr. Binger took the precaution of jotting down on his memorandum pad the serial number of the note. He did this quite openly as a gentle hint to Parker that it would not be well for the latter to swerve from the straight and narrow path. Here's $1,000, he said. That'll be a large enough deposit no matter what price the bed brings. Tell them you will send them the balance with it in a couple hours. Ralph Henry Parker carefully deposited the bill in his own lean wallet and started uptown immediately on the errand which he felt confident was going to lift him eventually from the ranks of obscurity to a partnership in the firm of Horatio Binger & Co. Inc. Chapter 2. To the Highest Bidder. The Marlborough Galleries and Auction Rooms are located on Fifth Avenue, within a stone's throw of the public library. The sales which are held there are attended by such a wealthy and select class of patrons that the gatherings almost take on an aspect of society function. Mr. George Augustus Marple, the suave, genial, well-groomed gentleman who usually presides at these assemblages, is not at all like the raucous-voiced auctioneers who wield the hammer at the cheaper type of salesman. His manner is almost always restrained, and his tone dulcet and subdued. He works more with his eyebrows than with his lungs. His going, are you all done? Is a perfect symphony. When he points out the beauties of a rare piece of porcelain, he sounds much more like a distinguished college professor addressing a class in archaeology than like a Coney Island barker trying to lure a crowd into a dime freak show. This prince of auctioneers knows his audience like a book. It's impossible to deceive him as to your social standing or the sincerity of your intentions. He is always courteous, but if you're a humble person of limited means who has wandered into the sale solely out of curiosity or to rub shoulders with the wealthy and fashionable, his keen, experienced eyes will instantly spot you out, and those eyes will soon make you feel so uncomfortable that you'll be constrained to rise and sheepishly depart. The Marlborough Galleries is no place for pikers. On the morning of the Mordsman's sale, the crowd which assembled there was an unusually brilliant one. The fame of the late copper magnate's collection of art and antique treasures was a magnet powerful enough to draw the owners of New York's most colossal fortune. The long line of high-priced limousines drawn up in front of the door when Ralph Henry Parker arrived on the scene somewhat awed that young man. Parker had not come up in a limousine. He had traveled uptown on the Broadway subway. Somewhat nervous because of that $1,000 bill in his pocket, he had thought at first of indulging in the luxury of a taxicab, but on counting up his resources, he discovered that, besides Mr. Binger's banknote, he had only 78 cents on his person, so he decided that he'd have to run the risk of getting his pocket picked in the Broadway too. The feeling of awe which the sight of that line of imposing equipages inspired in him was not diminished when he stepped into the doorway of the auction room and caught a glimpse of the distinguished-looking occupants of the long rows of gilt chairs. It was the first time in his life that he had ever sat amid an audience which exuded such an atmosphere of opulence. To add to his embarrassment, as he made his way towards the seat, he collided forcibly with a young woman who was just coming in and almost knocked her off her feet. The collision was entirely her fault, but that did not prevent him from feeling very much disconcerted by the mishap. She was a very good-looking young woman, and the way she stared at him out of her big dark eyes branded him as a clumsy bore as severely as if she put the accusation into words. With a stammered apology, he sat down in a vacant seat in the last row of gilt chairs, painfully conscious of the fact that the frock-coated gentleman on the auctioneer's rostrum was regarding him with a coldly critical eye. The sale had already begun. The small bronze incense burner was being spiritedly bid for. The price had already been run up to $25,000, and Parker again experienced a sensation of awe as he heard the figures advanced by the $1,000 bill. Evidently, $1,000 is a mere bagatelle to these people. It didn't seem to occur to any of the bidders to offer an advance for the less amount. The article was finally knocked down to a stout dowager for a small sum of $50,000. From the expression of the triumphant satisfaction on her face, it was evident she considered she had gotten the bargain. The sale of several rare pictures followed. Small masterpieces of Turner, Corot, Browns Halls, and Van Dyck kept the gentleman with the hammer busy until noon, but engrossed through the latter was in his task, he found time, nevertheless, to fix a stern, almost accusing glance on Ralph Henry at a frequent interval. In spite of that young man's well-groomed appearance, the auctioneer's unerring instinct had accurately sized up his social status. But where George Augustus Markle's instinct had for once playing him false was in fact that he believed the nervous, obviously uncomfortable young man in the last row of gilt chairs was an intruding trifler who had neither the intention nor the means of making a bid on even the less important of the auction. The auctioneer was, therefore, somewhat annoyed when at 1:30 p.m., after a recess of an hour and a half had been taken to permit both the audiences and salesroom force to partake of refreshments, Parker was among the eager throng which came hurrying back to the auction. Evidently the fellow intended to make a day of it, and was too thick-skinned to perceive that his room was preferable to his company, especially as the audience had grown to such proportions that even standing room was at a premium. But Mr. Markle's annoyance changed to astonishment presently. At 2 p.m., after an impressive pause in proceedings, the auctioneer announced that the time had now come for the big event of the day. It's probably unnecessary for me to dilate on the importance of the next item on the catalog, ladies and gentlemen, he said with a deprecating smile. The history of the famous bed, the gem of the entire Morseman collection, is no doubt well known to all of you. Its almost priceless value is a work of art enhanced by the romantic associations that surround it, I'm confident you all appreciate it. It is my proud distinction to submit for your kind consideration the royal statebed of Godfrey, the Mad King of Bavaria, and I give you the assurance that it will be sold to the highest bidder, regardless of its real value. Pause dramatically. Now, who'll start the bidding at $40,000? Of course, it's going to bring several times that figure before we're through, but we got to start somewhere, and I'm willing to hear any bid. There was a rustling of catalogs, a clearing of throats, and a hushed murmur among the audience. Then Ralph Henry spoke up. "I'll bid $10,000, he cried, his voice pitched nervously high above its normal register. The auctioneer's eyebrows went up. "Now, really, my dear young man," they protested, "this is ridiculous. In the first place, it's quite apparent to me that you can't afford to pay $10,000 for a bid. In the second place, even if you were serious, the inadequacy of your bid is positively shocking." Of course, he didn't give verbal expression to these thoughts, but his eloquent eyebrows plainly conveyed the message. "Will anybody start the bidding at $40,000? He inquired, haughtily ignoring Parker's offer. $30,000 then? Will somebody please say $30,000, just to break the ice?" "Oh, thank you, Mr. J," smiling at a white-mustached gentleman in the front row who just carelessly nodded. "I knew you wouldn't overlook this unparalleled opportunity to add to your collection, sir. $30,000 I am bid, ladies and gentlemen. 30,000. Do I hear any advance?" 31,000, said young Parker. 32,000, a woman's voice put in. 40,000 came from Mr. J in the front row, who is one of the world's most famous millionaire art collectors. 40,000 I am bid, cried the auctioneer, with a reproachful glance at Ralph Henry. "Going at $40,000? Do I hear any?" 41,000, spoke up Parker. 43,000 came from a woman who had bid against them before. She was sitting 3 rows ahead of him, and he identified her as the attractive young woman with whom he had come into collision on earlier in the auction. Several new bidders now joined in. $1,000 advances came from all parts of the room. Apparently, the bed of the demented Bavarian monarch was very much in demand, and Mr. Binger's anniversary present to his wife was going to cost him dearly. 60,000, the process known as Mr. J offered presently, becoming impatient. 60,000 I am bid, cried the gentleman with the hammer. "Going at 60,000. Are y'all done? Any advance on 60,000? Going. 61,000, said the young woman with whom Ralph Henry had collided. 65,000, the latter shouted with reckless abandon, and followed an impressive huff. Several lorgnettes was turned in Parker's direction. The young men at the reporter's table in front of the room glanced at him curiously and whispered among themselves. The auctioneer's face wore a dubious frown. 70,000, snapped Mr. J, and stood up in his seat to glare at the presumptuous young man in the back row who was giving him all this trouble. 70,000 I am bid, cried the auctioneer, beginning to love Ralph Henry now, although he suspected the sincerity of the latter's intention. The fellow might be, and undoubtedly was, an irresponsible four-flusher, but at all events he was serving a useful purpose by compelling the affluent Mr. J to extend himself. Going at 70,000. Are you all done? Who says 75? Is it obvious, ladies and gentlemen, that we are wasting valuable time if we take less than $5,000 advances on this superb piece of furniture, the prize of the Morseman collection? Who'll make it that 75,000? Going at 70? Going? 71,000, cried Parker's woman competitor, her voice tremulous with anxiety. I'll make it 75, Ralph Henry announced. The auctioneer's eloquent eyebrows went up again. Once more the lorgnettes and curious glances were turned on Parker. There were beads of perspiration on his forehead, and the collar was wilting, but he was beginning to enjoy himself. He had gotten over his stage fright now, and the attention he was attracting was not entirely displeasing to him. He grinned cheerfully. $75,000 was a lot of money to pay for a bed, and Mr. Binger had authorized him to go as high as $1 million if necessary. The contest was thrilling while it lasted, but he was confident as to the outcome. "Gentlemen and ladies seem determined to outbid you, Mr. J," remarked the auctioneer insinuatingly. "Will you say 80,000? If you can get the bed at that figure, I don't have to tell you that you'll be getting a bargain, sir." The millionaire collector scowled and shook his head. "No, I've gone my limit," he declared. "I don't want it as badly as all that." 75,000 I am bid, chanted the auctioneer, his gaze sweeping the sea of faces before him searchingly. "Going at 75. Do I hear any advance?" He did not hear any advance. Parker's young woman rival had given up the fight. She too had reached her limit, and the other bidders had already dropped out of the race. In vain, George Augustus Market chided, argued, and pleaded. All his tricks failed to bring in another bid. Sold to the young man at the back of the room for $75,000, the auctioneer finally snapped, bringing his gavel down with a crash. "You step up to the cashier's desk, sir?" Parker arose jubilantly. He had successfully carried out his mission. The bed was now Mr. Binger. All that remained to be done was to adroitly elude the questions of the newspaper reporters who were already moving toward him as he made his way down the aisle to the cashier's desk. There was no escaping him. They surrounded him at the end of the aisle and bombarded him with eager, insistent interrogations. Did he tell him his name? Would he be buying the bed for himself? What did he intend to do with it? Was he a collector? Did he have any photographs of himself in his pocket? He smilingly shook his head and declared that he had nothing to say. Absolutely nothing, gentlemen. He hated publicity, he explained, and never allowed his name to appear in the newspapers if he could help it. At length, he managed to break through them and presented himself to the cashier. The latter had been holding a whispered conference with the auctioneer, and he eyed the purchaser of the bed sharply. "You will give us your check now, sir. It is our rule, you know, that where a customer is absolutely unknown to us, payment must be made before delivery. I hope that can be agreeable." "I can't give you a check," said Parker, a significant gesture towards the reporters at his elbow, "but I will pay you in cash. I suppose a deposit will do? I didn't come here expecting to pay cash down, but I have $1,000 with me that I can let you have." $1,000 is rather a small deposit, sir, on a $75,000 purchase. I'll bring you the rest of the cash within the hour. In the meantime, you'll have the bed for security. It is to remain here, in fact, until I send for it. The cashier considered for a moment, then nodded. "Very good, sir. Deposit of $1,000 in cash will be satisfactory." Ralph Henry Parker's hand went to his coat pocket. Then a cold moisture sprang to his brow, and an exclamation of mingled horror and dismay escaped his lips. "Good heavens! I've been robbed! My wallet, my money is gone!" The cashier's face froze. "Robbed!" he echoed, with an ironic inflection. "That's really too bad, sir. But of course you understand that we cannot hold the goods without a deposit. Unless you're able to satisfy us to your good faith in making the bid, we shall have to put the bed back into the sale again." Chapter 3. A Time Limit. For a moment, Parker was completely overwhelmed by this double disaster. Not only would he have to report to his employer that he'd made a flivver of his confidential errand and failed to secure the royal bed which Miss Binger coveted, but he would have to confess that he was minus the $1,000 bill which Binger had entrusted to his care. If he could acquire the title to his bed, perhaps the loss of the money would not be such a great calamity. After all, $1,000 is not a very large sum to Horatio Binger. In his satisfactory over getting the bed, the latter might be inclined to overlook his Ralph Henry's querulousness in allowing his pocket to be picked. But here was the cashier of the auction rooms threatening to put the magnificent bit of furniture back for the sale, and bid for over again because of Parker's inability to pay a deposit. It looked very much as though Binger wasn't going to get that bed after all, and in his disappointment the millionaire was not likely to be very gracious about the disappearance of the $1,000 bill. He'd probably insist on his unhappy employee making good the loss of weekly installments deducted from his pay envelope. Perhaps he might even refuse to believe Parker's story he'd been robbed and would call the police and have Ralph Henry arrested. That $1,000 bill must be recovered. He must go to the police himself and report the loss of his wallet. The chances of the pickpocket being apprehended were not very bright, he realized, but the denomination of the note offered him some hope. $1,000 bills cannot be easily put into circulation without attracting attention toward the holder, and perhaps if an alarm was sent out immediately, the police might be lucky enough to get a line on the thief when the latter attempted to dispose of his loot. Even if fortune favored him to that extent, however, the distressing fact remained that Ralph Henry had failed to make good on the confidential mission on which he had built such a golden host. There was no possibility, of course, of his recovering his lost wallet in time to prevent that confounded bed from being put back into the auction and knocked down to some other bidder. He might save himself from going to jail, but that was about the best he could expect now, unless the cynical, hard-faced auctioneer cashier could be moved to mercy. Parker clutched desperately at that straw. "Can't you give me a little time? It's most unfortunate this thing should have happened. My pocket must have been picked on the subway. Every dollar I had with me was in that wallet. There's no question, however, about my good faith in bidding on the bed, and if you'll wait for just 1 hour, I will try. I will bring you the money. The cashier frowned and shook his head. It isn't fair to ask it of us, he said coldly. The crowd is here now. We shall have no trouble in selling the bed over again, perhaps at a better figure than it was knocked down to you for, if it is put back into the sale immediately. But if we were to wait for even an hour, some of our best customers might be gone. His frown deepened into a scowl. Besides, we don't know you, sir. You're a stranger to us, and frankly, Mr. Markle, the auctioneer, has an idea that you're not really serious in making that bid. Serious? I've never been more serious in my life. Just give me an hour to get the money and I'll show you. The cashier shrugged his shoulders. Unless you're able to put up a deposit as our rules call for, I'm afraid the sale is off, he rejoined. You can't blame us for protecting ourselves against trifling. I am no trifler, Ralph Henry protested. I want that bed. I must have it. See here, he continued, suddenly changing his tactics. You talk about fairness, but there are two sides to that. What about my rights in this matter? Whether you believe it or not, I made the bid in good faith and the article was sold to me. It isn't my fault that I'm able to satisfy your requirements as to the deposit. I feel quite sure that no court would hold you justified in depriving me of my property in the circumstances by offering the bed for sale again without giving me a chance to bring the money. I insist on my legal rights and warn you that I shall place the matter in the hands of my attorneys and instruct them to bring suit against the concern for heavy damages if the bed is sold to anyone else. The cashier is somewhat impressed by this threat. We have no desire to be unreasonable, sir, he said a little less aggressively. We're entirely within our rights, of course, and have no fear of a lawsuit, but perhaps if you were to identify yourself and are satisfied as to your ability to pay the $75,000, we might, the matter might be satisfactorily adjusted. He paused. What is your name, sir? Ralph Henry Parker. And your address, Mr. Parker? The young man hesitated for a moment. If he gave his boarding house number, the revelation of the neighborhood he lived in was not likely to make much of an impression. My office is in the Windsor building on Lower Broadway, he announced presently. In business, eh? What line, may I ask? The word peanut sprang at Parker's lips, but he caught himself just in time. I'm in the produce business, he volunteered. Broker on produce exchange. The auction room employee exchanged, his tone much more respectful. Suppose your name's in the telephone book, Mr. Parker. I don't, of course, Ralph Henry stammered. What bank references can you give us, sir? If you'd permit us to call up your bank and make an inquiry as to your financial standing, I have no doubt that the matter of the deposit could be waived and the bed held for you. I won't give you any references, Parker declared. I consider all this cross-examination entirely uncalled for when I'm prepared to bring you the $75,000 in cash within an hour. The bed is mine, and my attorneys will hold you responsible if you dare to dispose of my property. The cashier shrugged again. He walked over to the auctioneer and held another whispered conference with him. All right, Mr. Parker, he said when he returned. We'll give you an hour. That's as long as we'll wait, though. It is now 3 o'clock. You're not back here by 4 and ready to hand us a certified check or cash for $75,000. The bed will be put up for sale again. Ralph Henry exhaled a deep breath of relief as he hurried out of the cell. Not yet out of the woods, by any means, but at least the situation now offered some hope. He had made up his mind what he was going to do. He would get Binger on the telephone immediately, tell him what happened, and urge him to save the day by dispatching a trusted messenger uptown with the money. The messenger could make the trip in much less than an hour, and everything would be all right, except for the loss of a $1,000 bill. The matter could be discussed with Mr. Binger later, but in the meantime, the bed of the Mad King Godfrey must be rescued. Peter rushed across the street to a cigar store and shut himself up in the telephone booth. Connect me with the chief at once, Mr. Bertram, he said eagerly when he got his number. This is Parker talking, of course. Don't you recognize my voice? Certainly I mean Mr. Binger. I must talk to him immediately. It's a matter of the greatest urgency. That's too bad, Miss Britton, the switchboard operator, Horace Binger and Co. responded. Hey, your business is so urgent, I mean. Mr. Parker, I can't connect you with the boss. He isn't in his office. He went out about half an hour ago and left no word when he'd be back. Would anybody else do? Holy mackerel, Ralph Henry groaned. Talk about rotten luck. I suppose you have any idea where Mr. Binger could be reached? No idea at all. Then give me Mr. Westfall, the cashier, Parker demanded desperately. The voice which came to him presently over the wire was not a pleasant one. Old Squeeze-a-penny Westfall was the office grouch. His manner of speech was in keeping with his disposition. "What is it?" he asked. "Mr. Westfall," said Ralph Henry, "this is Parker of the Eastern Sales Department. I am uptown on an errand for the chief, and I'm in trouble. I've had my pocket picked. My wallet containing a $1,000 bill has been taken, and $1,000 bill? My word, that's a lot of money. Have you notified the police?" "Not yet. I intend to do so later, but that's not the point. The idea is that I must have $75,000 immediately. It's very important. Young man, you sound to me as if you've been invited." "I swear to you that I'm perfectly sober. I'm up here on business for the boss, and I must have the money sent to me at once. You see, Mr. Westfall, this is the situation He broke off suddenly. Two young men had drawn near the telephone booth and were standing in an obvious listening attitude. Parker was quite sure that he recognized them as two of the newspapermen who had been covering the auction today. "I can't very well go into details now," he told the cashier. "It's an exceedingly confidential matter, and there are a couple of eavesdropping chaps outside trying to catch it in on the secret. If they find it out, the fat will be in the fire. I daren't mention any names, but the party I spoke of before wanted me to make a purchase uptown, and I have told you I have unfortunately lost the money. If you will send—" "Lost it? You said just now that you've been robbed." "Of course, but the money is gone. That's what I'm trying to make you understand. I gotta have $75,000 in less than an hour, or—" "Why $75,000? You said the amount that was stolen from me was $1,000. "That was only a deposit. I must have all the money now, and there isn't any time to be lost. If you will rush somebody up here with it right away, Mr. Westfall." "Young man, I'm quite sure now that, in spite of the prohibition law, you have managed to become intoxicated," the cashier cut in. "The talk is disgracefully incoherent. $75,000, eh? I shall report this impertinence to Mr. Binger and see that you're discharged for annoying me in this outrageous manner." Parker started to protest, but found that he was trying to talk over a dead wire. The indigent Mr. Westfall had rung off. He deposited another nickel and got a connection with the office. The switchboard operator refused to put him back on the cashier's extension. "I daren't do it, Mr. Parker," I told him. "He got a big drag with the boss, and he'd have me fired. He called me down to something fierce just now for letting you bother him in the first place. Why don't you come downtown and have a talk with him?" Ralph Henry decided that he'd better follow that suggestion. He could get downtown to the office and back within the hour if he hurried. He had not much hope, though, of being able to persuade Westfall to let him have the money. Even if he could get the grouchy cashier to believe his story, the chances were 1,000,000 to 1 that the latter would refuse to draw his $75,000 and hand it to him with an okay from Mr. Binger. Without an okay from Mr. Binger. That was hardly a squeeze-a-penny Westfall's way of doing business. Binger might return, however, in time to save the situation. Parker brightened at that thought as he rushed towards the subway station, but he was doomed to disappointment. When he arrived at the office, an employer was still absent, and Mr. Westfall wouldn't even listen to it. Chapter 4. The $1,000 Bill. Ralph Henry hung around the office until 3:45, impatiently waiting for Binger to put in an appearance. Then, realizing that if he waited a minute longer, it'd be too late, he dashed out of the building and up Broadway to the Marine Savings Bank. He had an account at that bank. Although, as we have said, most of his income went towards the maintenance of his wardrobe, and he was obliged to stint himself in various other ways in order to live up to his standard of clothes, he had managed to save $1 out of his salary and deposit it in savings bank every week for the 2 years he'd been working in the office of Binger & Co. By his thrift, he had accumulated $104. His balance was bigger than that. The year after his arrival in New York, he had inherited a small legacy from a relative and had deposited the greater part of it, so that there now stood to his credit on the savings bank book the sum of $550. He had vowed to himself that, no matter what happened, he would never touch a cent of that money, not until it had grown to $1,000. The first $1,000 was the hardest to save, he had read, and when he had gotten that far, one was on the high road to success. He decided now, however, to break that vow. When he arrived at the bank, he drew out his entire balance. It was his only chance of making good on the mission, which was to put him permanently in the good graces of the president and majority stockholder of Horatio Binger & Co., and not much of a chance at that, as he despondently realized. In his desperation, it occurred to him that if he drew out his money and hurried uptown with it, there was a slight possibility the auctioning people might be induced to accept it as a deposit on the bet. It was hardly to be hoped, of course, that they'd be satisfied with such a small sum. They were expecting him to return with an entire purchase price of $75,000, and would naturally protest his offer a deposit was only half the amount originally offered by him. but he might be able to talk them into accepting. The auction room cashier had been obviously impressed by his threat to take legal action if the bed were resold. Some further talk along those lines might be effective. It's worth trying it. Unfortunately, there were several people ahead of him at the pay teller's window. It was 3 minutes before when he finally thrust the $554 in his pocket and hurried out of the bank. Still, he had not abandoned all hope. The subway would get him uptown within 15 minutes, barring accidents, and although they had a set of 4 p.m. as the time limit, the auction people might wait a little longer before putting the bed up for sale again. This wasn't too much to expect of Dame Fortune, even though she seemed to be inclined to treat him like a stepchild. As he sped northward on Broadway Express, Ralph Henry's optimism began to assert itself. Somehow, that $550 in his pocket gave him confidence. He had a hunch that everything was going to turn out all right after all, and the hunch kept getting stronger as he neared his destination. After all, if the auctioneer's cashier was obdurate, there was always the expedient of taking the fellow into his confidence, whispering in his ear the name of the great millionaire he, Parker, represented in this transaction. That ought to do the trick. There's a step to be avoided, of course, if possible, for the fear that the man might break faith with him and pass on the information to the newspaper reporters. But better than that, than to lose the bet altogether. With these reflections to encourage him, Ralph Henry, although exceedingly anxious, was feeling almost cheerful when, at 4:25 p.m., he re-entered the Marlborough Gallery. The sale was still going on. From over the room bids were being hurled at smiling gentlemen on the auctioneer's rostrum. Parker listened apprehensively for a moment and exhaled a deep breath of relief as he assured himself the article being bid for was a Turner landscape and not a bed. He strode down the aisle to the cashier's desk. "Well, here I am," he said, trying to speak nonchalantly. "So I see," the man behind the counter rejoined coldly. "What can I do you for, sir?" "Do for me? You don't mean to say that you don't remember me? I'm the party who bought the bed. I brought you the money as I promised. That is to say, I have brought a deposit. I suppose that will be—" "I'm sorry, sir, but you're too late," the cashier cut in. "The understanding is that you're to be back by 4. It is now 4:30, and naturally you cannot expect us to wait. The bed has been put up for sale again, and has just been bought by this young lady here." It was only then that Ralph Henry became aware of the presence of the girl at his side. In his excitement, he had not noticed her standing there before. She was the young woman who had bid so determinedly against him, the young woman he had bumped into when he first entered the auction. Their eyes met, and a smile of triumph curved her lips. It seemed to Parker that there was a trace of defiance in her manner. "I'm sorry to disappoint the lady," he said, turning to the cashier, "but she can't have the bed. It's my property, and I expect to be sold. I object to its being sold over again." "Objection overruled," the man sneered. "Go ahead and bring a legal action against us if you wish, sir. That's your privilege. We're entirely within our rights, and I'm not afraid of your taking the matter into court. But let us not have any further discussion about it now, if you please." "But if you knew—" Parker began. "I won't listen to any more arguments," the cashier interrupted impatiently. He turned to the girl, and his frown dissolved into a smile. "Where do you wish the bed shipped, miss?" he inquired defiantly. "You can send it to his address," he said, handing him a card. "I suppose you expect me to pay the deposit. I haven't the entire amount with me, but I can give you something now on account, and you can collect the balance when the bed is delivered." "That'll be perfectly all right." "I object," Ralph Henry began again. Then he stopped short, his eyes opening wide with amazement. The young woman had just placed her deposit on the counter. It was a single banknote, and its denomination was $1,000. It might be merely a coincidence, of course, but it looked startlingly significant to Parker. For from where he stood, he could see the serial number on the bill the young woman had just laid down. It was D40009682A, and the serial number of the $1,000 bill that Binger had handed him began with a D, a 4, and 3 ciphers. He didn't remember the rest of it, but he was quite positive about the first figure. Still, now he had taken it for granted that his pocket had been picked on the subway, but at this moment he was not so sure about that. He had not missed his wallet until he was inside the auction room, and this young woman had forcefully collided with him as he entered the place. He did not look like a thief, but one could never judge by appearance. If this was a coincidence, it was certainly exceedingly remarkable. Chapter 5. Facing the Music. Ralph Henry's first impulse was to denounce a young woman who had just acquired title to the state bed of the Mad King Godfrey, to accuse her of grand larceny and demand her arrest. But he checked that impulse. It occurred to him that such a course would in all likelihood be attended by rather unpleasant consequences. He had no proof to offer immediately that the $1,000 bill was the one that had been stolen from his pocket. The only way he could prove that would be by calling on his employer to substantiate his charge. Binger had jotted down the number of the banknote before he handed it to him, and by producing that memorandum, he conclusively proved the young woman's guilt. But this could not be done, unfortunately, without opening the eyes of newspaper reporters to the fact that the Peanut King was desirous of getting possession of the famous bed. Parker realized that such publicity would be anything but agreeable to his boss. He did some quick thinking and decided to keep suspicions to himself for the present. After all, he reflected, nothing was to be gained by acting hastily. The girl flashed him another triumphant smile, then turned and left the auction room. Ralph Henry followed her unobtrusively. It was his intention to shadow her until he had ascertained her identity and where she lived. Then he could report the situation to his employer and leave it to the latter to decide what could be done. His evil star, however, still appeared to be in the ascendant. He did not learn the young woman's name or address that day. He trailed her up Fifth Avenue as far as Central Park. There she hailed a passing taxicab, in which she rode off westward through 59th. Parker looked about him in vain for another cab in which to continue the chase. There were plenty of taxis in sight, but they were all occupied. He was obliged to stand by helplessly and watch his quarry disappear. He went back to the auction rooms and had a talk with the cashier. The latter indignantly refused to give him any information about the identity of the purchaser of the bed. The fellow laughed incredulously at Ralph Henry's assertion that the deposit the young woman had paid was the bill that had been stolen from his pocket. He advised Parker to consult an alienist and threatened to have him committed to the psychopathic ward of Bellevue Hospital if he did not immediately make himself scarce. Parker went home to his boarding house and spent a sleepless night. At 9 o'clock the next morning, he presented himself in the private office of Mr. Horatio Binger. His face was haggard, and he had forgotten to shave. His employer looked at him sharply. "Well, young man, how did you make out at the auction yesterday?" "Rotten," Ralph Henry replied dejectedly. "I not only failed to buy the bed, but I've lost the $1,000 bill you gave me. That is to say, it was stolen from me." "Stolen, eh?" Mr. Binger frowned dubiously. "Let's hear the story." Parker told him what had happened. "I'm awfully sorry, sir," the young man wound up, "but perhaps everything will turn out all right after all. If we act quickly, we may still be in time to get that bed and nab the young woman, too. Probably haven't left the auction room yet, and although they wouldn't give me any satisfactory yesterday, you'll put the matter at once in the hands of your attorneys, and they will most likely sing a different tune." Mr. Binger frowned, shook his head. "I shan't put the matter in the hands of my attorneys," he declared. "I hardly think that is necessary." "But it is your only chance of getting the bed, sir," Parker protested, "and of bringing about the arrest of that woman who robbed her. If you delay, the bed will be delivered to her, and she will have skipped before we can put our hands on her." Peanut King shrugged his shoulders. "I hardly think there's any danger of her skipping," he remarked, "and I have changed my mind about that bed. I don't want it now." A broad grin suddenly illuminated his face. "You see," he continued, "I happen to be aware of the identity of that young woman. Her name is Elise Van Orsdell, and she's employed as my wife's private secretary. Miss Binger sent her to the auction sale yesterday to bid for that confounded bit of furniture. She had read about it in the newspapers and decided she wanted it, not dreaming, of course, that I contemplated buying it for her as a wedding anniversary surprise. So she sent Miss Van Orsdell there to buy it, handed her a $1,000 bill I had given her yesterday before I left the house, to deposit to her private account. Then it wasn't the same bill that was stolen from me," Ralph Henry exclaimed. "Apparently not. I had a couple $1,000 bills in my pocket, and no doubt their serial numbers ran consecutively. The pocket was probably picked in the subway as you first completed. At all events, you can be sure that Miss Van Orsdell had nothing to do with it. That little lady is the last person in the world I suspected dishonest. But don't worry about your loss, son," Binger went on. "It was a mighty lucky thing for me that it happened. Saved me a matter of $10,000. You say that the bed was sold to you for $75,000. Well, Miss Van Orsdell bought it at $65,000 the second time it was put under the hammer. Old Archibald K. Jackson, the millionaire collector who had been running up the price for you when he bid on it, had gone home by the time it was put up for sale again, so my wife's secretary got a bargain. In the circumstances, you can just forget about that $1,000. Ralph Henry Parker went dazedly back to his desk in the outer office. This happened 3 months ago and he's still sitting at that desk. New York rise that he expected to come out of his confidential mission hadn't happened yet. His salary is still $22 a week. But on more than one occasion, the president is concerned has nodded pleasantly to Ralph Henry on his way to or from his private office. He no longer seems totally unaware of that young man's existence, and Parker believes this is an encouraging sign. And that was Mr. Binger Buys a Bit. Proof that sometimes the simplest decisions can lead to the biggest life. Thanks so much for spending some time with us tonight. If you enjoyed this lighthearted classic, let me know in the comments what kind of stories you'd like to hear next. I have been Felix Lubezki for SL Tonight. We're reading Rainbow for Grownups, and we are where the nightmares go. Take care, and I'll see you next time. Good night.